They say every civilization has its secrets, but some secrets are darker, older, and more human than we care to admit. Welcome to the channel that uncovers the hidden side of history, the desires, rituals, and obsessions that shaped the people who built our world. And today we travel to ancient Thebes, the city of myths and gods, of Oedipus and Dionysus, but also, as whispers say, of breeding control and an unsettling quest for human perfection. In the age before Athens' philosophers and Sparta's soldiers defined Greek power, Thebes stood in the heart of Boeotia, a proud and sometimes dangerous rival. To the outside world, it was a city of poets and warriors, of sacred bands and secret cults, but deep within its walls, rumors tell of a practice that blurred the line between training and breeding, a deliberate cultivation of men and women designed not for peace, but for war. It begins with the idea of the perfect soldier, one whose body, spirit, and loyalty are absolute. In Thebes, this ideal took a form unlike any other Greek city. While Sparta raised its warriors through state training, Thebes may have gone further. According to some ancient writers, they paired their most elite fighters with lovers, mentors, and partners, not only to strengthen emotional bonds, but to breed excellence into the next generation. It's a claim that lingers somewhere between fact and myth, whispered in the shadows of Greek memory. To understand how such an idea could exist, we have to enter the ancient mindset. For the Greeks, sex and strength were not separate things. Beauty was virtue, and the body was the measure of the soul. A perfect physique hinted at moral superiority, a divine spark of order in a chaotic world. So when Theban leaders looked to create unbeatable warriors, it made a kind of twisted sense that they would seek not only to train them, but to reproduce them. One of the oldest stories linked to this idea revolves around the sacred band of Thebes, an elite unit of 300 soldiers, each paired with his male lover. Ancient sources like Plutarch describe this force as unbeatable in its prime, its members bound together by love so fierce that defeat was unthinkable. But in later retellings, darker rumors grew around them. Some said these pairs were chosen in childhood, bred from families known for strength and beauty. Others whispered that Theban generals oversaw unions between the city's finest men and women in secret festivals, offering gold to those who conceived children deemed physically perfect. Was it true? No record proves it. Yet, in the murk of Theban legend, such stories persist, a reflection perhaps of how the Greeks imagined perfection could be engineered. Some even claim that the city's priests of Heracles oversaw these unions, believing that through controlled passion, divine strength could be passed on, generation after generation. It's as if the Thebans saw the human body not as a gift of the gods, but as something to be molded, improved, refined through bloodlines. And yet, Thebes was no mere eugenic experiment. It was a city obsessed with myth and transformation. The god Dionysus, born of fire and divine madness, was worshipped there with rites that blurred the boundaries between the sacred and the sensual. Perhaps, within this ecstatic culture, the idea of breeding perfection wasn't seen as monstrous, but as sacred. If the gods themselves were born of violent unions and divine mixtures, why shouldn't humans attempt the same? As we walk through the dim streets of ancient Thebes, past the temples and gymnasia, we can almost feel that tension between reason and desire, discipline and indulgence. Every marble statue of an athlete, every hymn to victory, carried an undertone of fertility, of creation through struggle. To the Thebans, the body was a battlefield, and perfection required sacrifice. Some stories go even further, claiming that the Theban elders maintained records of bloodlines, lists of men whose lineage traced back to warriors of the city's golden age. Young women were allegedly chosen to receive these favored bloodlines, ensuring that strength, courage, and beauty would not fade. Whether or not these accounts hold truth, they echo something deeper, the ancient fear that greatness could die out if not carefully preserved. And in a world where war never ceased, where neighboring cities plotted and empires rose and fell, that fear was not irrational. Thebes, surrounded by rivals, sought survival through excellence, and excellence they believed could be bred. We can imagine the ceremonies, real or rumored, the flicker of torches in marble halls, priests invoking Heracles' name, soldiers standing in solemn ranks while chosen couples were blessed to conceive in the name of the city. Perhaps these rituals never truly happened, but the fact that they were ever believed to have happened tells us something crucial about how ancient people understood power. They saw perfection as destiny, and destiny could be designed. In this first glimpse into Thebes' mysterious breeding culture, we see not just a city, but a reflection of a universal human desire to control nature, to perfect it, even when doing so leads us down the darkest paths. They called them the Sacred Band, 300 warriors whose loyalty was not forged only in training fields, but in the quiet intensity of love. The story has the clarity of myth. Each pair, a lover and a beloved, stood side by side in battle, bound by devotion so absolute that retreat would have been a betrayal not just of city, but of soul. When Thebes rose to power in the 4th century BCE, these couples were its living ideal of unity. To the outside world, they seemed almost supernatural, an army of devotion. Yet within Thebes itself, the sacred band became something even more symbolic, a living experiment in how passion could be weaponized. Ancient Greece never fully separated eros from excellence. The physical and the moral grew together like vines around the same pillar. Philosophers could write that love between men made courage stronger. Poets sang that beauty sharpened virtue. So when Thebes institutionalized this principle, it felt less scandalous than it might today. A young man was expected to admire the older soldier who trained him, to emulate his body, his poise, his valor. The relationship was half mentorship, half worship. What made Thebes distinct was how openly it turned that dynamic into state policy. Pairing lovers in arms was not simply tolerated, it was celebrated. From here the rumors expanded. Later chroniclers, some centuries removed, claimed the Theban generals saw these pairings as the foundation of a new human type. In whispered accounts, they were said to monitor which couples produced children, as though valor could flow through bloodlines. Perhaps this was no more than the imagination of later storytellers, trying to explain why the sacred band fought with such frightening cohesion. But the image persisted. Thebes as a city not merely training soldiers but cultivating them, weaving emotion and lineage into a single military design. Archaeologists have never found proof of breeding registries or controlled unions, yet inscriptions and poems hint at civic rituals celebrating the seed of heroes. These festivals, probably athletic contests, might have been misinterpreted by later generations as literal breeding ceremonies. Still, the overlap of the erotic and the martial was unmistakable. In gymnasia, young men exercised naked, an aesthetic of transparency that blurred discipline with desire. The same sculpted bodies that paraded before the gods were those who would stand in the phalanx. Beauty, courage, and fertility shared one vocabulary. The psychological logic is easy to grasp. A warrior who fights beside his lover will not flee. Shame becomes unbearable. Courage automatic. The Thebans, more pragmatic than mystical, must have recognized this. Yet because Greek thought linked the body's vigor to lineage, the idea of cultivating strong offspring was never far behind. Even without an organized program, parents sought to marry into families known for athletic triumphs or noble bearing. The boundaries between civic pride, personal desire, and biological aspiration blurred until they felt like one continuous pursuit of perfection. Inside the city, the influence of Dionysian worship added another layer. Thebes was the birthplace of Dionysus, god of ecstasy and transformation. His rites promised liberation through excess, a dissolution of ordinary limits. Participants wore masks, drank wine, and danced until their identities blurred. To outsiders it looked chaotic. To initiates it was purification. When love and war mixed in Thebes, it happened in a culture already comfortable with the idea that ecstasy could lead to transcendence. If the body could be unbound through ritual, perhaps it could also be reshaped through lineage, a divine experiment written in flesh. Ancient sources describe the sacred band's discipline as severe. They trained year-round, isolated from the rest of the army. They were not a temporary unit raised for one campaign. They were a permanent brotherhood. Each pair lived together, ate together, and was expected to die together. The battlefield became an extension of intimacy. A spear thrust that saved a beloved's life was an act of devotion as much as strategy. To modern ears it sounds romantic. To their enemies it sounded terrifying. Over time, the myth of their origin began to swell. Some said the founders of the band chose their warriors after sacred contests of beauty and strength, watched over by priests of Heracles. Winners were marked with symbols of the lion and the club, the gods' emblems of virility. These are embellishments, not records, yet they reveal how later Greeks imagined Theban perfection. Half military, half erotic mystery. Even the notion that Thebes paired its finest men, so that their passion might beget valor, shows how readily the ancients translated emotion into heredity. When Thebes defeated Sparta at Leuctra in 371 BCE, the legend was sealed. 300 pairs of lovers broke the might of an empire. After that victory, storytellers could say almost anything about them, and people would believe. Some claimed they drank a shared potion before battle, others that they performed secret rites invoking Heracles' bloodline. Each version added a layer of the uncanny, as if ordinary training could not explain their success. What made the sacred band extraordinary, however, was likely simpler: the psychological power of shared devotion and the discipline of constant practice. Yet myth always demands something more than reason. Behind the triumph lay the same question that haunted all Greek cities. Could excellence be preserved? Every generation feared decline, the fading of heroism into softness. The Thebans' supposed breeding of perfect warriors was a fantasy that answered that fear. If courage could be passed like an inheritance, the city would never fall. The idea was seductive and not uniquely Theban. Echoes of it appear later in Roman notions of noble blood and, centuries beyond, in darker modern ideologies. The myth of Thebes becomes a mirror in which every age sees its own obsession with perfection. What we know for certain is this: the sacred band stood for decades as a living symbol of unity between body and soul, desire and duty. Their story ends tragically at Chaeronea, where they were annihilated by Philip II of Macedon and his young son Alexander. When the Macedonians found their corpses still locked in pairs, they honored them with burial instead of mockery. Even enemies recognized that kind of devotion. Thebes' experiment, whatever its truth, had achieved something rare. It convinced the world that love itself could be a weapon. And as the city's fame faded, the rumors grew darker, as though the memory of such intensity demanded an explanation more extreme than reality could offer. People whispered of selective unions, of priestly oversight, of secret archives listing the offspring of heroes. None of it is proven, yet all of it points to the same human fascination that began our journey. The dream that greatness can be engineered, that desire and discipline together might sculpt a better species. In Thebes, that dream flickered bright enough to become legend. When the story of the sacred band ends on the battlefield, Thebes itself keeps breathing. Its streets alive with the quiet rhythm of ordinary lives shaped by extraordinary ideals. Behind the public splendor of warriors and festivals, families in Thebes carried the private burden of a city obsessed with perfection. Every generation was measured against the ghosts of heroes. Sons were expected to match their fathers in courage, daughters to bear children worthy of the city's name. Even in households untouched by the army, the cult of the body and the promise of greatness hung in the air like incense. Women in Thebes occupied a paradox. They were both revered as vessels of renewal and restricted by the same ideals that glorified men's strength. Historical fragments tell us Theban women could hold property, that priestesses officiated in the mysteries of Demeter and Dionysus, yet their value was often tied to lineage. Marriages were negotiated with an eye for pedigree, beauty, and athletic ancestry. The idea that certain families carried a nobler strain appears again and again in inscriptions and poetry. It was not state policy, but it shaped private expectation. Later writers, especially those who viewed Thebes through the lens of myth, expanded this into something far stranger. They spoke of sacred festivals where couples were blessed by priestesses of Demeter, the goddess of fertility, to ensure strong offspring. These tales, written centuries after Thebes' fall, probably reflect ritualized fertility customs common across Greece. Processions, offerings, and symbolic unions meant to honor the earth's fruitfulness. But in the retelling, the rituals gained a darker edge. Some claimed the priestesses selected men famed for military valor to participate, as though divine favor and human excellence could mingle in flesh. There is no record of this actually occurring, yet the legend endured, another echo of that Theban obsession with creating perfection. At the center of these stories stands Dionysus, Thebes' most ambiguous god. Born of fire, twice born from a mortal mother and Zeus himself, he embodied contradiction. Discipline dissolved into frenzy, masculinity blurred with feminine grace. His cult celebrated ecstasy but also rebirth. To participate in the Dionysian mysteries was to die symbolically and emerge renewed. It's easy to see how later storytellers, steeped in fascination with Thebes' warrior past, imagined connections between these rites and the city's supposed breeding ideals. The promise of transformation, through ritual, through lineage, through passion, was the same. In reality, most Theban households were likely preoccupied with the same concerns as any Greek city: managing land, arranging marriages, securing dowries, surviving war. Yet even in mundane acts, the city's mythic identity seeped through. Parents named their sons after heroes of old: Pelopidas, Epaminondas, Heracles, hoping a spark of greatness might live again. In a culture where ancestry could be traced to gods, every birth felt like a gamble with destiny. The child's first cry carried centuries of expectation. Archaeological finds from the region, terracotta votives of infants, small figurines of nursing women, and plaques depicting muscular youths, suggest how intertwined fertility, beauty, and strength were in Theban imagination. Each offering was a prayer that the next generation would embody the city's virtues. To outsiders, this could look like a cult of perfection. To the Thebans, it was devotion, a way to thank the gods for vitality itself. Still, rumors thrive where ideals burn too brightly. Long after Thebes was destroyed by Alexander the Great, travelers repeated stories of houses of selection, where maidens of noble birth were secluded until they conceived from chosen partners. Historians today treat these tales as moral fables invented by rivals, perhaps Athenian writers eager to portray Thebes as decadent. Yet the persistence of the story says something about ancient imagination. The Greeks often explained extraordinary success by invoking extraordinary causes. If Theban soldiers had once seemed superhuman, then surely their city must have engineered them. One legend tells of a queen who dreamed that the god Heracles commanded her to unite the strongest man and the most beautiful woman in Thebes to forge the seed of lions. The next morning, according to the myth, the queen arranged a union that produced a line of warriors who would later fight at Leuctra. It's a story with no basis in fact, but a powerful metaphor. Strength and beauty merging under divine sanction, an image that blurs into the real historical ethos of the city. There is another layer, quieter but more poignant. For all their talk of lineage and valor, the Thebans also lived with fragility. Wars could erase families overnight. Plague could undo generations of careful marriages. Perhaps the legends of selective unions were a way to impose meaning on that randomness. If fate could not be trusted, then control, real or imagined, offered comfort. The myth of breeding perfect warriors becomes not just a story of ambition, but of fear. The fear of losing greatness, of being ordinary again. In the sanctuaries that dotted the countryside, temples to Apollo, Athena, Demeter, Theban parents offered sacrifices for healthy children. These were not the acts of tyrants seeking eugenic perfection, but of humans pleading with divine powers for strength and survival. Yet when later storytellers gathered these fragments, they saw patterns of purpose. A civilization trying to master creation itself. They turned prayer into policy, hope into experiment, myth into accusation. And so Thebes became, in the imagination of the ancient world, a cautionary mirror. The city that loved too fiercely, fought too perfectly, and sought to shape its destiny too boldly. Every legend of breeding, every rumor of selective unions tells us more about the storytellers than the city. Still, beneath those embellishments lies a kernel of truth. The recognition that Thebes, perhaps more than any other polis, viewed the human body as sacred ground on which the fate of the city was written. The women who walked its streets, the soldiers who trained in its fields, the priests who sang in its temples, they all participated in a culture that saw creation as a civic duty. Whether by birth, by training, or by love, each generation was asked to perfect what the gods had begun, and in that pursuit myth and reality became indistinguishable. To the rest of Greece, Thebes was always a riddle. The same city that produced poets and prophets also fielded an army bound by love. Its victories were so sudden, its confidence so fierce, that other polis struggled to make sense of it. When stories began to circulate about Theban breeding, they were not born from eyewitnesses but from envy and unease. Athens preferred to imagine its rivals as corrupted by excess. Sparta, humiliated at Leuctra, whispered that no natural army could have defeated them without divine or unnatural aid. In that space between admiration and resentment, legend found fertile soil. Athenian playwrights, never shy of scandal, began hinting at Theban decadence in their comedies. One fragment describes the city as a stable of stallions, its men proud, beautiful, and dangerously passionate. The joke carried a sting. To the Athenian audience, Thebes represented everything ungoverned, emotion over reason, body over mind. It was easier to laugh at tales of selective unions than to admit that Theban discipline on the battlefield had outclassed their own. The myth of breeding perfect warriors became propaganda, a moral explanation for military humiliation. Spartan accounts were darker. After their defeat, some Spartan commentators claimed Thebes had betrayed proper Greek masculinity by letting affection interfere with austerity. Yet others, grudgingly honest, admitted that the sacred band's unity could only come from devotion deeper than fear of punishment. Even enemies could not quite decide whether to condemn or revere them. Thebes became a mirror reflecting each city's own anxieties about virtue, pleasure, and control. As generations passed, historians like Diodorus and Plutarch tried to reconcile rumor with respect. They preserved the facts of Theban heroism while entertaining the possibility of ritualized selection and divine guidance. Plutarch, himself a Boeotian, treated the sacred band with tenderness, emphasizing love as moral strength rather than corruption. But later Roman writers, viewing Greece through the lens of empire, revived the stranger stories, claiming Theban priests once measured newborns and offered the weak to the gods. There is no evidence of this practice. It belongs to the literary imagination, a way for Romans to project their own anxieties about discipline onto a conquered past. By then, Thebes was long destroyed. Alexander the Great had razed it in 335 BCE, sparing only temples and the house of the poet Pindar. The ruins invited invention. Travelers stood among toppled columns and tried to picture the city that had once terrified Sparta. Without living witnesses, myth filled the silence. Some said the earth itself groaned with the voices of the fallen sacred band. Others swore that ghostly pairs still guarded the plain of Leuctra at night. These are not histories but echoes, proof of how deeply the idea of engineered devotion had entered collective memory. For later philosophers, Thebes became a moral allegory. To some, it was the warning of hubris, a city that tried to perfect nature and paid the price. To others, it was proof that love could elevate duty above fear. Both readings survive because both touch something true. The Greeks themselves debated whether human excellence came from birth or education. Plato spoke of breeding guardians for his ideal republic, echoing the same impulses that rumor had already attributed to Thebes. Reality and philosophy looped back upon each other, until the line between speculation and doctrine blurred completely. Outside Greece, the legend kept evolving. In Roman times, writers connected Theban myths with their own origin stories. Romulus and Remus, twins of divine descent, another experiment in chosen lineage. Later, medieval chroniclers, unfamiliar with Greek customs, misread the homoerotic devotion of the sacred band as literal procreation rituals, turning symbolic unions into tales of flesh. What had begun as a metaphor for loyalty became, through centuries of retelling, an imagined program of breeding. Each era reshaped Thebes to suit its fears and fascinations. Yet beneath the exaggerations lies a persistent truth about how societies interpret power. The stronger the discipline, the more outsiders imagine hidden cruelty. The more radiant the beauty, the more they suspect artifice. Thebes, with its sculpted athletes and unflinching soldiers, invited that suspicion. The idea of the perfect warrior was already unsettling. Add love, ritual, and victory, and myth almost writes itself. Modern historians read these sources cautiously. Excavations show no sign of eugenic institutions, only the ordinary pattern of Greek civic life: gymnasia, sanctuaries, family shrines. What survives most vividly are the graves at Chaeronea, where 254 skeletons lie aligned in ranks, their arms interlocked. That unity, frozen in death, explains more than any rumor. Thebes did not need breeding to produce perfection. It needed conviction. Still, the legend persists because it touches something deeper than evidence. Every age wrestles with the temptation to control human destiny. In Thebes, myth turned that temptation into poetry. To speak of breeding perfect warriors was to imagine a world where courage could be guaranteed, where love could be engineered to serve the state. Whether or not the Thebans ever dreamed it, others dreamed it for them, projecting onto their ruined walls the oldest human wish. That greatness might be predictable. As the centuries rolled on, the image of Thebes shifted again. Renaissance scholars rediscovered Plutarch and revived admiration for the sacred band's virtue, stripping away the darker rumors. In the 19th century, archaeologists and poets made them symbols of romantic heroism. The supposed breeding practices faded into metaphor once more, a story about unity, not control. And perhaps that is the truest form of their legacy. Standing among the fields where Thebes once stood, the traveler feels little trace of the ancient city. Only the wind moves through the grass, whispering stories that no historian can quite silence. They tell of devotion so complete it seemed unnatural, of a city that believed love could make men invincible. The details shift with every telling, but the feeling remains: fascination mixed with unease, admiration shadowed by fear. Thebes endures not because of what it truly did, but because of what humanity needs it to have done. A mirror for our own restless desire to master ourselves. Centuries after Thebes had vanished from the map, its story refused to fade. In the quiet study halls of Renaissance Europe, scholars pored over Plutarch, Diodorus, and the fragments of Greek poets. The sacred band, once a concrete military unit, became an idea, a model of devotion, loyalty, and, to some imaginations, perfection. Philosophers of the Enlightenment looked back and saw not only heroism, but the potential for human design. The notion that courage, strength, and virtue could be cultivated, even inherited. They were captivated by the legend that Thebes might have attempted to mold its citizens through love, lineage, and ritual, interpreting it less as historical record than as inspiration. The myth evolved as a lens through which later societies examined their own anxieties and aspirations. French philosophers, fascinated by social contracts and the organization of the state, sometimes cited Thebes when discussing education and moral cultivation. Could a city, they wondered, create citizens more virtuous, disciplined, or loyal than nature allowed? The stories of carefully paired lovers fighting side by side provided a poetic, if morally ambiguous, model. To them, the legend of Thebes was a thought experiment as much as a history lesson, the city that tried to engineer devotion and excellence. Romantics found a different allure. The sacred band, locked in life and death, became an emblem of love inseparable from courage. Poets and painters in the 18th and 19th centuries portrayed them as tragic heroes, their devotion elevated into art. The supposed breeding practices, once the focus of rumor and moral panic, were softened into metaphors. The city that nurtured virtue through intimacy, the idea that the bonds between men could create a new kind of excellence. In literature, Thebes shifted from a place of discipline to a stage for passion, a cautionary tale about loyalty and mortality. At the same time, historians combed through archaeological evidence, trying to separate fact from embellishment. The ruins of the Cadmea, the graves at Chaeronea, and inscriptions left faint echoes of civic pride and military organization, but nothing of formalized breeding programs. The secret unions whispered about by later writers remained elusive. Perhaps they had never occurred, or perhaps they existed only as ritualized or symbolic gestures. Modern scholarship recognizes that most ancient rumors about engineered perfection reflect cultural fascination rather than state policy. Yet even skeptics concede the psychological truth. A city that valorized beauty, courage, and loyalty would inspire its youth to strive for those ideals. By the 19th century, when nationalism and the study of antiquity intertwined, Thebes's legend took on new political resonance. The myth of perfectly devoted warriors inspired military theorists and moralists alike. Tales of male pairs locked in battle offered models of unity that transcended mere physical strength. The idea that devotion could enhance courage and discipline resonated with armies seeking cohesion, even as scholars continued to debate the literal truth of the city's practices. Here the story became a mirror. Societies could project onto Thebes their hopes for disciplined citizens, loyal soldiers, and a moralized body politic. Artists, too, embraced the legend. Paintings, novels, and operas portrayed the sacred band with a mix of realism and fantasy. Their bodies, heroic and idealized, became symbols of perfection beyond ordinary human limits. The alleged rituals and pairings, whether factual or imagined, allowed storytellers to dramatize the intensity of loyalty, the blending of love and martial valor, and the human longing to perfect what the gods had given. In this way, Thebes lived on not as a city of stone but as a city of ideas. Even in modern thought, the myth continues to provoke questions about human nature. Psychologists and sociologists examine how devotion and shared purpose can amplify courage. Military theorists study cohesion and morale, noting that intimate bonds, whether familial, romantic, or fraternal, strengthen performance in ways that training alone cannot. The legend of Thebes, while historically exaggerated, provides a powerful narrative for thinking about loyalty, motivation, and the interplay between emotion and action. Yet the story also warns of obsession. The legends of selective unions, careful pairing, and attempts to shape future generations through deliberate design linger as metaphors for human hubris. Every retelling carries a shadow, the seductive temptation to control bodies, relationships, and destiny itself. Philosophers and ethicists have long recognized that myths like Thebes's sacred band reflect our enduring desire to mold perfection and the dangers that accompany it. Through it all, the city itself remains mostly silent. Archaeologists uncover stones, graves, and inscriptions. Historians parse texts. Artists and writers reshape myths. But the human fascination, the need to imagine a city that could perfect its citizens through courage, devotion, and perhaps love, endures. Thebes becomes a canvas onto which generations project ideals and anxieties, combining admiration, fear, and longing. In the end, the story of Thebes is not only about warriors or lovers. It is about how civilizations conceive of excellence, how they try to preserve it, and how they imagine it can be transmitted across generations. The legend invites reflection on the relationship between love and duty, nature and nurture, myth and history. It shows the power of narrative to shape our understanding of what humans can achieve and what they might risk in pursuit of the perfect self. And so, in the echo of ruined walls and empty fields, Thebes whispers still, of warriors bound by devotion, of generations dreaming of perfection, and of a human longing so profound it cannot die. Even when empires crumble, the city may no longer exist in stone, but it endures in our stories, our myths, and the timeless fascination with what it might have achieved if human ambition and love could be engineered into one. Long after the walls of Thebes had vanished into the dust, the city's ghost continued to walk through the minds of philosophers and statesmen. The tale of warriors bound by love, of a people who seemed to sculpt courage from desire, haunted the Greek world that succeeded them. In Athens, where Socrates once spoke of the soul's ascent through beauty, his students could not ignore the memory of the sacred band. Plato had already imagined a republic in which the guardians would be chosen for strength and wisdom, mated selectively to preserve the virtues of the state. Whether he borrowed from Theban example or arrived there by logic, the resemblance was unmistakable. The dream that the polis could breed its own perfection. Aristotle, ever the realist, recoiled from such dreams. He dismissed talk of selective unions as hubris against nature. Yet even he conceded that good birth produced good character more often than chance. The debate itself shows how deeply the myth of Theban perfection had entered philosophical air. It became shorthand for the tension between reason and desire, control and spontaneity. When later Stoics spoke of discipline and the shaping of the self, they echoed that same impulse in ethical form rather than biological. Among ordinary Greeks, Theban legend softened into romance. Poets sang of comrades who fought side by side, as the sacred band once did, turning historical soldiers into symbols of devotion unbreakable by death. The notion of breeding disappeared. What remained was the idea that love, purified through courage, created a new kind of man. In the gymnasia of Hellenistic cities, teachers still invoked the band as moral example. Thebes's rumor of engineered perfection became, paradoxically, an argument for the power of voluntary affection. When Rome absorbed Greece, the story changed shape again. Roman writers, fascinated by discipline and lineage, found in Thebes both admiration and warning. The early republic prized the strict father, the obedient son, the household as miniature army. The Theban experiment seemed both alluring and dangerous, an echo of Rome's own desire to turn virtue into inheritance. Virgil and Livy hinted at chosen lineages, at families who carried divine favor in their blood. Though they never named Thebes, the parallel lingered, the idea that courage could run like a current through generations. By the imperial period, philosophers such as Plutarch and later Dio Chrysostom were already reinterpreting Thebes through moral allegory. Plutarch, proud of his Boeotian heritage, wrote of the sacred band as a marriage of affection and honor, a union that refined both body and soul. He scolded those who repeated lurid rumors of breeding, calling them idle tongues. Yet by defending the city so fervently, he ensured that those rumors would never fully die. Every denial keeps a story alive. Roman moralists used Theban legend as a mirror for their anxieties about decadence. Juvenal mocked patrician youth who sought lovers instead of discipline, invoking the ghost of Thebes as a warning. Others, more sympathetic, saw in the sacred band the possibility that love could strengthen rather than soften resolve. In an age when the empire worried about decline, the image of devoted pairs dying together at Chaeronea offered a purity that politics could no longer provide. Beyond philosophy and satire, artists kept reshaping the myth. Wall paintings in Pompeii show dueling heroes identified by later scholars as members of the band. Their embrace after combat is half tender, half tragic. Whether the painter knew the historical details hardly matters. The story had become a language for impossible loyalty. The supposed breeding rites faded completely, leaving only the idea that Thebes had once tried to perfect humanity through love. In this transformation lies a curious irony. The very rumor that began as accusation of unnatural control became, over centuries, the emblem of natural devotion. What outsiders once condemned as manipulation turned into legend of unity. Thebes had been reimagined again and again to satisfy whatever the world most desired at the moment: discipline for the philosopher, romance for the poet, moral warning for the priest. Each retelling trimmed away what was uncomfortable and emphasized what was useful. By late antiquity, Christian commentators encountered Theban stories through the filter of moral allegory. To them, the sacred band illustrated the perils of idolizing the flesh. Yet some monastic writers quietly admired their brotherhood and mutual sacrifice. Even within a new moral universe, the echo of Theban devotion remained. The city's imagined pursuit of perfection, whether through breeding or through love, had become part of the shared vocabulary of Western thought. The yearning to refine the human condition, to make loyalty and strength hereditary virtues. Meanwhile, the actual ground of Boeotia grew quiet. Farmers plowed over the fields where the band had fallen, temples crumbled, the ruins of Cadmea sank beneath newer villages. But travelers still sought the graves at Chaeronea. Pausanias, wandering in the 2nd century CE, described the stone lion that marked the resting place of the 300. He made no mention of breeding or eugenic dreams, only of courage and unity. By then, myth and memory had finally separated. The legend of Thebes as breeder of perfection belonged to rumor, the reality to reverence. Yet history has a way of reviving its own metaphors. Centuries later, when Renaissance scholars rediscovered Plutarch, they also revived whispers of ancient programs of selection. Philosophers speculated again about whether human excellence could be designed. Some cited Plato's guardians, others hinted at Thebes. The story's details changed, but its emotional current remained. Admiration for discipline, fear of control, fascination with the border between love and power. In this way, Thebes continued to influence thought long after its stones were gone. The idea that a city might shape the virtues of its people, through education, through example, through the careful matching of minds and bodies, never truly died. Modern readers might see in it an early parable about the ethics of human improvement. The Thebans themselves, if they could speak, might simply call it devotion. And so we come to the end of our journey through Thebes, a city both real and imagined, where history and legend intertwine like the threads of a tapestry too complex to untangle. From the disciplined rows of the sacred band to the whispered tales of selective unions, the city has always existed on two planes, as a material place of streets, temples and battlegrounds, and as a mythic construct, a canvas upon which humans have projected their desires, fears, and ideals. Every rumor, every embellishment, every speculation tells us as much about those who told the story as it does about the city itself. The legends of Thebes, particularly those of its warriors and their supposed breeding practices, reveal a fascination with control, over the body, over love, over destiny itself. In the minds of outsiders and later generations, Thebes became a cautionary tale, a city that might have tried to shape humans as one shapes clay, molding courage, beauty, and loyalty into perfection. Whether any of this ever truly occurred is uncertain, but the potency of the narrative speaks to a universal human impulse, the longing to perfect ourselves and our societies, to ensure that greatness does not fade with each generation. Throughout our exploration, one theme emerges again and again: devotion. The sacred band, whether through love, friendship, or the bonds of mentorship, achieved a unity that terrified enemies and inspired allies. Later rumors, no matter how implausible, preserved the intensity of that devotion, magnifying it into stories of ritual, lineage, and even divine design. In the absence of concrete records, humans turned awe into imagination, fear into myth, and fact into legend. Thebes, in this sense, never truly disappears. It lives in the questions it provokes about human nature, loyalty, and the intersection of desire and discipline. We can imagine the city in its prime, gymnasia echoing with the footfalls of young athletes, the temples alive with incense and the murmur of prayers, the training grounds filled with pairs of warriors, whose devotion elevated them beyond mere skill. The women of Thebes, the priests, the ordinary citizens, all participated in a culture that prized excellence, beauty, and cohesion. And while the details of any formal breeding program may belong only to rumor and myth, the cultural logic behind it is not entirely implausible. A city obsessed with virtue, courage, and unity would naturally seek to perpetuate those qualities in the next generation. As time passed, the myth evolved. Greek philosophers debated the nature of virtue and inheritance. Roman moralists recast the story as a lesson in discipline or excess. Renaissance scholars revived the admiration of courage intertwined with love. Poets, painters, and writers dramatized the devotion of the sacred band. In every era, Thebes became a mirror, reflecting contemporary concerns about human potential, morality, and the power of relationships to shape outcomes far greater than the sum of individual effort. Even today, Thebes continues to captivate us. Modern historians and archaeologists sift through ruins, searching for the realities behind the legends. Scholars study the graves at Chaeronea to understand the organization and discipline of the sacred band. Psychologists analyze devotion and group cohesion in human behavior. Artists reinterpret the story in literature, film, and visual media. And the general public, fascinated by the intersection of sex, love, and military power, finds in Thebes a story that is both shocking and inspiring, a glimpse into the human desire to perfect what is fleeting and fragile. Reflecting on this journey, it's clear that the allure of Thebes lies not in the certainty of its history, but in the ambiguity between history and legend. Did the Thebans really attempt to manipulate desire and lineage in pursuit of perfect warriors? Perhaps. Perhaps not. The truth is obscured by time, by propaganda, and by centuries of imagination. What remains is the emotional resonance, a story of devotion so absolute that it could bend mortality itself, a city that dared to dream of human excellence as something tangible, something to be cultivated, preserved, and defended. And so, as we leave the ruins of Thebes behind in our minds, we carry forward the questions it raises. How much can humans shape their own destiny? To what extent can love, loyalty, and ambition be engineered, or should they be? And what do we make of the human fascination with perfection, whether through body, lineage, or spirit? These are not questions with easy answers, but they are questions worth asking, because they echo across millennia, connecting us to a city that, though gone, still challenges and inspires. If one fact or story from Thebes surprised you most, whether the devotion of the sacred band, the rumored rituals, or the enduring myth of engineered excellence, let us know in the comments. History, after all, is not just about facts. It's about the stories we carry forward, the lessons we imagine, and the human impulses that remain unchanged across time. And if you want to explore more hidden corners of history, to uncover the intimate, erotic, and sometimes shocking practices of civilizations long past, make sure to subscribe. The world is filled with stories like Thebes, forgotten, misremembered, mythologized, but always fascinating. Join us as we continue to journey into the hidden histories of sex, sexuality, and the human pursuit of perfection, discovering how the past still speaks to us today.